In 1983, 17-year-old Cindy Paulson is frantically running barefoot and handcuffed down 6th Avenue. A man in a truck passing by responds to her desperate, frantic flailing, stopping to let her in. He drops her safely at an inn nearby, then calls police who catch up with Paulson and learn of her harrowing tale. She describes how a man she had perceived as frail and geeky had solicited her for sex, kidnapped her, and chained her by her neck in his basement, where he tortured and raped her repeatedly. He then took her to the airport, where they were about to board his private plane to go to a place he told her he'd taken many other women to for fun. But she managed to escape, and it's a good thing she did, because the fun that he referred to may have been fun for him, but could not have been further from the truth for his victims. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. Today, we'll be talking about the incomprehensible case that terrified a small Alaskan community, the case of the Butcher Baker. It's a case that reminds us that we should never make assumptions, neither about people's credibility nor someone's capacity to kill. Let's dive in. Robert Christian Hansen, known to his friends as Bob or Bobby, was born on February 15, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, to his American mother, Edna Hansen, and his Danish immigrant father, Christian Hansen. His parents owned a bakery, and Robert would grow up working in that bakery. Hansen's younger years were challenging. From a young age, he worked many hours in the family's bakery and had frequent conflicts with his domineering father. Although he was left-handed by nature, Hansen was forced, as many people were during that era, to use his right hand instead of his left, the stress of which made his already existent stuttering problem much worse. As a teenager, he was extremely skinny, shy, and had severe acne that left him permanently scarred. He was ridiculed by the boys at his school and faced rejection by the girls he liked. As a loner and social outcast, he sought refuge in the time he spent alone. And over time, he developed a passion for both archery and hunting wild game. He would channel his anger and revenge fantasies into the sport of hunting animals. In 1957, at age 18, Hansen joined the U.S. Army Reserve. He hoped to leave his troubled youth behind and make something better of himself. And for a while, he did. After serving for a year in the reserves, then being discharged, he landed a position as assistant drill instructor in Pocahontas, Iowa. There he met a younger woman, fell in love, and in the summer of 1960, he married her. However, all of this wasn't enough to make him forget his troubled past. He still felt mistreated by the community and was constantly seeking retribution. So in 1960, at the age of 21, he convinced a young bakery clerk to help him burn down the school bus garage to retaliate against people he perceived had abused him. But unfortunately for Hansen, the boy turned himself in and also implicated Hansen. Hansen was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The conviction resulted in Hansen's wife divorcing him after just a few short months of marriage, leaving him alone and locked up. While incarcerated, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with manic depression and periodic schizophrenic episodes. He specifically noted that Hansen had an infantile personality and was obsessed with getting back at people that he felt had wronged him. Hansen was released after a year and a half, after which he'd be arrested several more times for petty theft. Despite all this, he somehow managed to attract and remarry another local woman named Darla in 1963. They would go on to have 2 children together. Then, in 1967, Hansen decided that he had had enough of the contiguous United States. So he and his family moved to Anchorage, Alaska, as far removed from his life in Iowa as possible. It was a good move for him. He quickly settled in and established himself as a respected member of the community. He also began making a name for himself as a skilled game hunter, getting his kills entered into the Pope and Young record book 3 years in a row from 1969 through 71. It was that year, 1971, that he decided he needed more challenging and, in his mind, more rewarding prey to chase, hunt down, and kill. Already intimately familiar with Anchorage's nightlife, particularly in the Tenderloin district, given his previous deviant tendencies, in 1971, Hansen began frequenting the district in search of victims. There, he found a steady and willing supply of women who would accompany him anywhere for a small amount of cash. And what's more, since they were typically either prostitutes or exotic dancers, he was confident that any who went missing would be barely missed. And any statements from victims he assaulted would be less likely to be believed, against his squeaky clean reputation. Between the money he offered them and the extremely harmless, frail appearance of this friendly neighborhood baker, potential victims saw no reason whatsoever to fear Hansen, but they should have. Once he had them captive in his car, Hansen changed. He revealed the true psychopath that he truly was. Either during or after they would perform the acts he purchased, Hansen would reveal his weapon, either a knife or typically a gun, handcuff her, then share his intentions to rape and torture her, which he would do once he abducted and transported them to his remote cabin in the Anchorage Mountains. Hansen's reign of assaults was almost cut short before it even took off. When in 1971, shortly after his assaults had just gotten underway, Hansen was arrested by police twice. His first arrest came for the kidnapping and attempted rape of a housewife, and the next one was for raping a prostitute. For his attack on the housewife, Hansen pleaded no contest to assault with a deadly weapon. Then the charge for raping the prostitute was dropped as part of a plea bargain. Hansen was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but after serving just 6 months of that, he was released to a halfway house and continued his attacks. Hansen's MO of targeting marginalized exotic dancers and sex workers, who would be less likely to report his attacks and be less likely to be believed if they did, was paying off. Most of his rapes went unreported or were not considered credible. As a result, Hansen was able to continue his attacks for several more years, escalating them from rape and torture to killing. In 1980, construction workers on Eklutna Road discovered a shallow grave containing the remains of a woman. They would dub the woman Eklutna Annie. She would never be identified. Then, in 1982, hunters found a second shallow grave on the banks of the Nick River bordering Anchorage. It contained the body of 23-year-old topless dancer Sherry Morrow, who was reported missing a year prior to that. She had been shot 3 times in the back, but the clothes on her body didn't contain any bullet holes, indicating that she'd been shot naked, then redressed after she was dead. And then finally, in 1983, police would get their best break in the case. 17-year-old Cindy Paulson is brought to the police station to report that a man has raped and tortured her repeatedly before he was about to force her into a plane to take her away. Cindy, who miraculously managed to escape, details her attack and attacker to police in painstaking detail, right down to his acne marks and stutter. Based on the description she provides, Hansen is easy to identify and find. But despite his prior run-ins with the law, police are still reluctant to detain him, given his mild and seemingly meek demeanor, his popularity in the community, and a solid alibi provided by not one, but 2 of Hansen's friends. Given police's assumptions, Hansen's alibi, and the fact that Cindy refused to take a lie detector test, Hansen was ruled out as a serious suspect. There was one detective, however, Detective Greg Baker, who felt strongly that Cindy was telling the truth, but his hands were tied. So, once again, Hansen remained free to continue his reign of terror. In 1981, after having lived in Alaska for over a decade, Hansen decided to continue the family tradition and bought a bakery. Then in 1982, he also purchased a private airplane, a Piper Super Cub. That is when his twisted killings turned even darker. Now that he had the means, he could transport his victims to his favorite playground, the wilderness outside of Anchorage, in no time at all. Over the next 2 years, he would load many of his victims onto that plane, transport them to his cabin in the woods, rape them, then depending on their response, either return them home or send them out into the cold, dark wilderness, naked, to run for their lives, against him, the hunter. Victims would be given a small head start, then ultimately captured after the hunt, and either shot or slaughtered with a knife by their hunter. That would be the fate of numerous women, the last of whom would be Paula Golding. Paula was found in a shallow grave in the Anchorage wilderness just 3 months after the kidnap and rape of Cindy Paulson. She had been murdered in the same manner as Sherry Morrow, including having been redressed after she was shot. That is when police realized that they were dealing with a serial killer. And that was all it took for Greg Baker, who was still harboring suspicions about Hansen. He kicked them into high gear and began digging deeper into Hansen's personal life and background. So apparently, after extensive searching, only then were they able to discover that Hansen had served time in 1971 for rape, kidnap, and assault with a deadly weapon. Why such readily available information about Hansen wasn't discovered when he was first called in is baffling. Baker outlined his suspicions and sent them to Sergeant Glenn Floth. Flood was heading up the Alaska State Troopers Topless Dancers Task Force. He began digging into Hansen's background as well. And by the time he was finished, he was convinced that Hansen was their man. So he reopened the Cindy Paulson case to try to gather more evidence. He started by interviewing Hansen's two alibis, threatening them with perjury if they were not being truthful. It worked. Both men quickly admitted that they lied to protect Hansen from what he told them were some embarrassing domestic indiscretions. The FBI was also involved, and they developed a psychological profile of the murderer based on the details of the case collected so far and the injuries inflicted on the recovered bodies. The profile pegged the killer as a skilled hunter with low self-esteem who had been rejected by women. It even suggested that he may stutter. Robert Hansen fit the profile perfectly. Once Hansen no longer had an alibi for the Paulson attack, and the FBI profile pointed squarely at him, a warrant for his arrest was imminent. And so on October 27, 1983, Robert Hansen was arrested at his bakery and taken in for questioning at the Anchorage Trooper Station. And they weren't leaving anything to chance. Floth had consulted with the FBI and staged an elaborate setup in the interrogation room prior to Hansen arriving. On the walls were maps of the Nick River, where Hansen would take his victims, along with pictures of the grave sites and the victims strewn about the table. There were also folders and files with the names and photos of Hansen's family, friends, and acquaintances. They left Hansen in the room alone to ruminate over everything he was seeing, all while investigators observed him on the other side of the one-way glass. Hansen didn't seem concerned at all, only fascinated. Then investigators entered. They would interview Hansen for 5 hours. Meanwhile, another team of officers was searching Hansen's home, cars, and plane. Hidden throughout his home, they would find souvenirs from his victims, including jewelry. They'd also find a 14-inch hunting knife, which would later be identified as the murder weapon used to kill Sherry Morrow and Paula Golding. And the largest piece of evidence they uncovered would be an aviation map riddled with X's. 2 of those X's marked the spots where the 2 known bodies had been found. And a third X reflected the location of a third body they had not connected to the serial killer, Joanne Messina. Joanne was a 24-year-old prostitute who, they would later learn, had last been seen with a thin, pockmarked man who stuttered. There was no doubt they had their man. Hansen initially denied any involvement in the murders. But once police divulged the mountain of evidence they had against him, he confessed. He began by describing how he would establish control over his victims, stating, "I pull out the gun. I think the standard speech was, 'Look, you're a professional. You don't get excited. You know there's some risk to what you've been doing. If you do exactly what I tell you, you're not going to get hurt. You're just going to count this off as a bad experience and be a little more careful next time who you are going to proposition or go out with.' I tried to act as tough as I could, to get them as scared as possible." Hansen acknowledged that the X's on the maps were, indeed, the locations of the women he had murdered. But he also divulged that he had not killed every girl that he'd taken to the wilderness. He shared that anyone who agreed to provide him oral sex, and that he felt liked him, was spared. So long as they agreed to not go to the authorities, he'd fly them back home. If a victim was not cooperative, he would force them to strip naked, sometimes going so far as blindfolding them, and then set them free in the woods to run for their lives. He would give them a brief head start, then hunt them down with a high-powered rifle or hunting knife. According to Hansen, it was like going after a trophy doll sheep or a grizzly bear. Like a cruel game of cat and mouse or hunter and animal, He'd sometimes let the victims think they'd escaped, track them down again, then make them start all over. He'd do this over and over again until the victims were either too cold or too exhausted to run any further. Then he'd shoot and kill them. He'd redress them afterward because he felt that it gave him control over them. Hansen pleaded guilty to the 4 homicides the police knew about and agreed to provide details about his other victims in return for serving his sentence in a federal prison, along with no publicity in the press. The prosecution agreed, and Hansen took investigators via helicopter to the wilderness. There, Hansen pinpointed the graves of 17 women he acknowledged murdering, 12 of whom the police did not know about. Since retrieval would not be possible for some time given the heavy snow on the ground, they marked trees at each gravesite with orange paint. 11 bodies would ultimately be exhumed and returned to their families, once weather permitted. On February 18, 1984, Robert Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder for the murders of Eklutna Annie, Jonah Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Paula Golding. All charges were dismissed for the other 13 cases. He was sentenced to 461 years in prison, plus 1 life term without the possibility of parole. Hansen's wife, Darla, and their 2 children attempted to stay in Alaska after Hansen was convicted. But after 2 years of the children being harassed at school, Darla filed for divorce, and the family left Alaska. Pope and Young, the publication that recorded Hansen's hunting achievements, removed his name from their record books. Hansen's case would go on to inspire the 1991 book, Butcher Baker, the true account of an Alaskan serial killer, which would later be adapted into a movie called The Frozen Ground in 2013. The case was also the inspiration for the 2007 film, Naked Fear. And the Discovery Channel TV series The FBI Files featured an episode entitled Hunter's Game, which depicted the Hansen case. Robert Hansen was first imprisoned at the maximum security U.S. penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. But in 1988, he was returned to Alaska. Hansen became one of the first prisoners sent to the New Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, a men's maximum security prison located south of Anchorage. And on August 21, 2014, at the age of 75, Robert Hansen died in prison of natural causes. Robert Hansen is evil. We're about 15 videos into this channel and continue to be just as sickened as we were in our first video by these people, these supposed humans, who feel they have the right to do these heinous things to other people, then take their lives. We're also pretty peeved that Hansen was able to continue his reign of terror for over a decade because people refused to believe that someone who looked like him could be capable of such heinousness, even in the face of so much evidence to the contrary. As usual, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We've definitely been appreciating them all. And if you like how we covered this case, please help us by hitting like and don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a single video.